bonjour tout le monde. J'aimerais commencer la présentation de Richard French. We're very lucky to have what I think is going to be an exciting and maybe even controversial presentation. Maybe. By Rick French, who's going to be the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa. He held recently the CN Paul Tellier chair in that department. Since he's talking about evidence-based and science, he wanted me to clear that he's a fan of that, and comes from a scientific background, having done his BSc in biological sciences at the University of British Columbia. Also note that he did his DPhil in history at the University of Oxford with a Rhodes Scholarship. And he has had a long and storied career in the public service, having been in the 1980s member of the National Assembly of Quebec for Westmount, holding ministerial portfolios in communications, science and technology, and supply and services. He served as senior executive for Bell Canada and Bombardier in Canada, India, and Germany, and works currently with a number of other companies. And his most recent public appointment, until just before he joined us here at the university, was as vice chairman of the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, the famous CRTC. And just as a final point, Rick was recently appointed as a member of the Order of Canada. So, congratulations. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over.
Thanks very much, Paul. Bienvenue à nos invités de l'environnement. You see how we live in the social sciences with food for lunch, so we're glad to have you. The purpose of my telling Paul is to tell you that I had a science degree and a doctorate in the history of science and medicine was to explain that I am not a skeptic about science, and in fact I'm a believer. Where I'm more critical is to try to understand how science fits in public policy, and that's the purpose today. I'm going to give you a report on research in progress. I'm about 75% of the way through this project. I expect the last 25% will not change fundamentally the conclusions, but of course I'll have to do the 25% to be sure that that's the case. I'm doing this project with Stuart Fast of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, but he hasn't got his hands on the paper yet, so I'm putting him in brackets, and he's not responsible for anything I say because he hasn't had the chance to tell me I'm wrong or anything like that. I've got a lot of slides. I've got 48 slides, and I'm not going to do them all. I'm going to try and cut to the chase fairly quickly. I'm also going to go fairly quickly because I think there's going to be a lot of questions. So without further ado. It's a literature review of the research and critique on the subject of evidence-based policy. So if evidence-based policy believes that we should use evidence, they ought to look at the evidence on evidence-based policy. And I break up the response in this research into 4 groups: reinforce, reform, reinvent, and reject. And I'm going to explain to you what those 4 schools are and try to draw out some of the main themes. The policy is, you know what it is. Evidence is organized knowledge produced in accordance with the standards of the relevant academic disciplines. I think this is important. I think this is what EBP proponents believe, and I want to insist on the notion that the evidence I'm talking about is not the varied evidence that you might imagine a public policymaker would take into account, but that which in some quarters is claimed to be missing in current policy efforts. That is organized knowledge, the kind of knowledge produced by people in this room. I want to caution here. When you read a scientific paper, you don't learn about the process of the science and the research and the failures and the confusions. You learn about the results. And when there is a policy announcement, you don't learn about how the policy came to be. You hear about the government's intentions, and you hear a nice rationalized version of what they're doing. So in both cases, you don't learn anything about the process. You don't learn about the process of science, and you don't learn about the process of policymaking. So You better be careful about making assumptions about that activity, okay? Don't confuse the neatly told package of the results of either policy or science with a realistic description of how it came to be. Okay, I'm going to skip these. Okay, so in these schools of thought, they're not airtight. They're a way of heuristic to help you to try to think through this massive material that I've worked on. But there's room for argument about any specific given researcher, or many specific given researchers, what school they should be in. The others are some are very clear, but some are a little on the borders of one or the other. What I'm trying to do is give you a simpler idea of this massive literature. So the reinforced school is the classic school of proponents of evidence-based policy. They think the government's backwards and that it's negligently refusing to look at scientific evidence. And they think the government ought to get with the program. They're frustrated by the failures of evidence to influence policy, and as far as one can tell from their literature, they don't read any of the evidence on evidence-based policy, notwithstanding their efficacy thereof. The reinforced school then is called by one of the key authorities the naive view. It's an aspirational ideal type in which we have a comprehensive sense of what we're trying to accomplish, and we move systematically through different pieces of research, and we analyze them for their relevance, and we come to the kind of conclusion that a scientific colloquium might come to on a subject of scientific interest, right? That is the notion that the classic EBP proponent believes ought to happen in policymaking. The reform school, like the other, this is not where we send adolescents who are deviants, this is the reform school on EBP. Like the reinvent and reject schools, the consensus here is that it's been very difficult, when you actually do research on EBP, to identify the successes of evidence-based policy. So they say, we've got to study it, we've got to use our imagination, and find ways to get around the barriers to the adoption of scientific knowledge and its useful application to policy. The reinvent school says, well, it's a little more serious than that. They look at the same base of evidence as the reform school, but they say, you know, we really need to turn things around in a major way, and I'll explain to you what this means when we get there. So there's got to be a big change in the way, either way we do research or the way we apply it to policy, and we've got to think systematically about about the kinds of changes that would be required. The reject school says a variety of two different things. One, the world is too complex for the science that meets disciplinary standards to be of much use in solving public policy problems. We'll explain what that complexity means in more detail. Alternatively, the reject school says knowledge is part of a social process. It's politically and epistemologically constrained, and there's no reason for policymakers to imagine what comes out of science to be any more privileged or any less morally compromised than other sources of knowledge. Knowledge and power are intertwined, and there's no particular reason why we should privilege one kind of knowledge, that is organized knowledge in this case, over others. Cognitive and political bias is inevitable. It's just that scientists pretend or try to control it, maybe a little more ostentatiously than the rest of us, but it amounts to the same sort of problem. So I want to be clear, the reject people do not say we shouldn't use the best knowledge. They simply say the best knowledge is not going to make much of a big impression on policymaking, because it ain't best enough. Either because the world is too complex, or because that knowledge, by the time it arrives at the level of, or in the process of policymaking, is already part of a broadly political process. So I'm going to go through a series of themes, which is kind of what I might call the common evidence-based of evidence-based policy. Right? And I'm going to hit these themes, and you can think about them and ask me questions if you want along the way. So, first of all, science doesn't play and cannot play as big a role, even in the best policy decision-making processes, as EPP proponents imagine. Because the organized knowledge in question is not research on policy problems, it's researchable problems which will pass the test of an editorial board. which will meet the standards of the discipline. And this is fine, but it ought not to be confused with the requirements of policymaking, because policymaking and policy problems present themselves in a radically different way. Academics assume incorrectly that they know how policy is made, and one of the big studies says, hard to defend academics from the charge of misunderstanding policy priorities or processes. You don't want to imagine that the primary usefulness of organized knowledge or evidence in the policy process is to resolve a specific policy problem today, tomorrow, next week. Rather, it plays, according to the researchers, an enlightenment function. That is to say, it supplies the vocabulary, the concepts, the kind of approach, general approach that policymakers gradually accumulate over time and become more sophisticated as a result of their reading of the general literature. It doesn't solve specific policy problems. It helps to think about policy and policy problems in a broader framework and in a way that eventually aids in policy making without being specific application of specific findings to specific results, specific policies. So the first is the instrumental or pipeline or linear concept of the application of science to policy. That is not the appropriate one. The appropriate one is the enlightenment function that I described. I'm sorry I'm going so quickly here, but there's a lot to get through. Science and politics are entwined in policy making. You can't separate them. There's no way that you can assume an absolute separation between the kind of advice a scientist gives or a specialist, technical specialist gives in a policy process and the political process that that technical expert is in part of. So the notion that somehow there is science over here and policy over here, when the rubber meets the road and scientists start actually talking and working with policymakers, that notion has to go out the window. Doctors differ. Scientists are found on both sides of many issues. There's 3 or 4 reasons for this. We know that experts in different countries facing the same base of data provide different advice. We know that there are experts who can be hired on both sides of every question. And so the people with the corporate interests who have the money to engage scientists are able to delay and confuse the process by, number 3, all kinds of technical quibbles. So the more we insist on the purity of the scientific method, the validity of its results, the application of rigorous procedures, the more we open up the possibility for doubters to quibble and create technical doubt in the minds of laypersons who are not equipped to judge these technical constraints. And I can tell you as a former regulator that sometimes you get in a situation where experts on this side and experts on that side, they disagree, and they disagree on issues that you can't even begin to understand. So how useful that is at the end of your regulatory process, quite good question. Another way of putting it is, it's not the technical problem which is at the heart of the problem. The problem is the resources that can be deployed by corporate interests or other large interests in order to delay and confuse the process. This is an important one that is really have to think about this in the next one. Academic departments arbitrarily divide the world into certain subject matter. The government departments arbitrarily divide the world into another set of subject matters. One, both of these divisions are arbitrary, and 2, they're also incommensurable. That is to say, they don't map one onto the other. So policy problems, as they present to policymakers, don't respect these fields, whether they're academic disciplines or they're government organizations. We say they are incommensurable. They don't map one onto the other. So the policy problems require more interdisciplinary work. They require better cooperation from among government institutions, and both of those things are a very tough assignment. So institutions, like disciplines or government agencies, have their own ways of doing things. Some approaches are salient, other approaches are less so. Some proofs of authentication are appropriate, some proofs of authentication are inappropriate. And those sorts of conflicts are very important in the way evidence is framed and used in those disciplines on the one hand or in those departments on the other. And the last big study by the US government says that the most important thing we can do in improving evidence-based policy is to understand the way institutional arrangements work. It's not to get better science, it's not to brainwash everyone that they've got to pay attention to science, it's to understand how these institutional factors operate. The gap between the two communities of research and policy may best be filled by resources. Oh yes, this is knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, knowledge brokers, a whole range of special functions which are intended to lubricate the frontier between science and policy. And they've been tried in various ways. They're controversial. Their effectiveness is controversial. I mean, obviously there's a lot of goodwill there, there's a lot of desire to improve things. But the effectiveness has been heavily criticized by other experts, including Professor Fafard. The fundamental and positive conclusion that comes out of this research, or one of the three important watchwords that comes out of this research, is direct and sustained relationships between the producers of organized knowledge and the potential clients in the policymaking world. And as it's been observed, this requires a high degree of persistence and stamina on the part of scientific researchers, or people who want their research to be useful for policy. It's not a one-off, it's not a throw it over the wall, it's getting to know and developing contacts